Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. If you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. Today we are going to talk about the lost Blue Bucket Mine in Oregon. And this story starts out in 1845. A wagon train had left Iowa for Oregon, and they traveled the Oregon Trail, and they were some of the earlier Oregon Trail crossers as the first travelers hit the trail around 1843 or so, only a couple years prior. And many years people would be traveling the Oregon Trail to Oregon, but they were only a couple years in. So when they stopped near present day Vail, Oregon, which is in the far eastern part of Oregon, they stopped off at a spring near the river, and by this point they had become upset because on the 1,500 miles or so that they had gone so far, they had lost quite a few oxen that had supposedly died, it said, of poisoning. And when one of the members of the wagon train had examined one of the carcasses, and I believe it said that he had some open wounds on his hands, then he would very soon die too. So I'm not sure how they were poisoned. My guess would be that they were poisoned from grazing on poisonous plants or got some kind of infections from, something along those lines. And maybe those infections were passed along to the gentleman that had some wounds on his hands that was maybe trying to determine what was happening when they were losing some oxen. So, anyways, because of this type of situation where they had lost quite a few oxen, tensions were high, and there was a lot of dissension in the ranks as the people were getting very frustrated. So tempers flared, and people wanted to just get to their destination and probably felt they had faced enough trials and tribulations already. And one member of the group, his name was Stephen Meek, he had joined the group in Idaho or so, and he said he had been to Oregon before and he knew a shortcut. And he had been on the trail with the group long enough for people to form an opinion of him, and some of the ideas that people had was that he should not be trusted. So as the group got ready to leave the springs, they decided to split in two. So one group would go the traditional way of the Oregon Trail, which followed closely to current day Interstate 84 in Oregon, and the other group followed Meek and his supposed shortcut route. So he quickly veered to a southern or southwestern direction toward the Steens Mountains. And within a few days, it became apparent he didn't really know where he was going. So the group got angry, and he fled for his life after only about a week with the group after they left Vail. At this point, the party seemed to have turned around and headed back towards the usual route of the Oregon Trail. So apparently they started to backtrack a bit. And it seems that dissension was still very high, and the group would split again. And part of the group would head back towards Huntington, Oregon, and Vail, and that area that they came from, and catch up with the normal Oregon Trail. And, then eventually go down the Columbia River and make their way towards the Dales. And the other part wanted to continue to follow the Malheur River's North Fork. So the part of the party that continued on the Malheur River is the one that we will be concerned with as far as this story goes. So as they continued along, one member got some kind of fever and died, and they also lost some oxen again. So on August 25th of 1845, it was said that 3 of the men went out to look for oxen. Now, there's some conflicting stories about exactly who it was. It may have been 3 young men, possibly teenage boys. It might have been 3 children or a few children sent to look for water. But anyhow, it seems more likely that maybe the reason that some reported it as being children and some report young men, maybe it's, teenage, 12, 13, 14-year-old kids or whatever that were sent to look around for the oxen and look for water. So anyhow, what happens is they're looking around, they're looking for the missing oxen, and they're walking around in the morning and a bit into the afternoon before they came to a small stream. So some reports say it was a very small stream with a little bit of water running in it, and some other reports say that it was more of like a gully or low area, a ravine or something like that had wet soil in the bottom of it. And so either way, whatever it was, they decided that they would try to get some water from this area. One of the reports says that they took one of the blue buckets they had with them for collecting water and they used it like a spade, and they dug into the moist soil at the bottom of the ravine or gully, and they were looking for water. And as they dug some of the wet soil out, they found some little, goldish, coppery colored rocks, and they thought they were pretty looking, and so they took a few of these stones with them, and they continued to dig for some water. They got some water, they quenched their thirst, and then they took a few of these little pebbles with them from this creek, and they eventually got back to the wagon train, and they had found the oxen, I guess, also, and so they were helping bring the oxen back to the wagon train, and they showed the rocks to an older gentleman who said they looked like copper. So you have to keep in mind, this is 1845, and these are pioneer types, farmer types. These are not miners or anything like that. Gold hasn't been found in California or anything like that yet, so no one is thinking about gold or that possibility at this point. So, when one of the older gentlemen looks at the little pebbles and says, "Oh, they look like copper," no one thinks twice about it. Because no one was out in the West really looking for gold at all at this point. So when that gentleman asked the kids if there was very much of this supposed copper, one of the young men said, "We could have filled one of these blue buckets." So at that point, no one's thinking too much of these supposed, little nuggets of copper. And Mrs. Fisher, one of the women in the wagon party, she took one of the nice rocks as a souvenir, and she took that from the boys, and it sounds like the boys just left the other pebbles or nuggets behind. And they would soon run into Stephen Meeks again, and he was with a group that was out looking to find them and save them or whatever. Apparently he made it to the Dales and they hadn't made it there yet, so he was out looking for them and brought a party to look for him. Well, eventually the wagon train made it in October of 1845 near the Dales. And nothing much was thought about their backcountry journey in Oregon until gold was discovered in California in 1849. So it's about 3.5 years later or so when gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill in California. So at that point, someone thought to check with Mrs. Fisher and the pretty rock that she kept from their trip, and it was soon discovered it was actually gold. So this started the search for the Blue Bucket Mine, and it was believed to be on a tributary of the John Day River. So I've looked quite a bit into the possible route up the North Fork of the Malheur River. And the headwaters of that river isn't too far from the John Day River if you continue to go north, but it gets pretty forested and pretty rugged, so it's really hard to say how far they were able to follow that North Fork of that river before it turned into pretty wooded wilderness area, and it's still a very wooded wilderness area, to this day, but maybe they made it through those mountains. There could have been a tributary or a stream somewhere along the North Fork of that river that could account for this story, or they could have got over the mountains, and a lot of people do believe that they did get over those mountains. They got to the John Day River and they followed it west, and a lot of people believe that that more likely the tributary was a tributary of the John Day River, and it's somewhere close to the John Day fossil beds, the Sheeprock unit, which is just south of Kimberly, Oregon today. So somewhere between the top end of the North Fork of the Malheur River, over to the John Day River, and over to the John Day Fossil Beds National Monument, the Sheeprock unit, because there's two units of these fossil beds. Somewhere in that area is where people believe that the lost Blue Bucket mine or this little tributary or creek may exist, and people believe it probably flowed into the John Day River. Now, the thing you got to think about too is all the reports do state that as they were finding these rocks and stuff, this wasn't a very vigorously flowing stream. It could have been that there was a bit of moisture. It was more of a gully and not a stream. It could have been a small little stream that flowed only after heavy rains. It could have been, silted in by now with, floodwaters and changing of, the topography after lots of rains. So there's a lot of theories as to where it could be, and if it could be buried in deeper, if it's still able to be accessed or found. And then there's people that think, it's possible that some secretive miner slash prospector had found this location and maybe mined all of the gold nuggets, or found all the the gold in the area. So it's hard to say for sure. But it seems there is enough documentation to prove that this actually did happen, and it had been mentioned in different pioneers' journals and other accounts around this time. So it is believed it did happen, and Mrs. Fisher did have the rock that was checked out later and determined that yes, it was gold. And so we know that this location did exist or does exist, and we don't know the exact situation of it today. So the story doesn't necessarily stop there. So there's another account of the story that comes from Captain W.H. Hembree, and his story was from April 28th of 1938. So he was interviewed for a Pioneer Days writer type project, I believe for a newspaper or a magazine, and he was interviewed about what he knew about the legendary Blue Bucket Mine and about the Pioneer Days in Oregon. And at that time, at 73 years old, this Captain Hembree, He was a rugged miner type whose father was in the very first Oregon Trail wagon train in 1843. So Hembree told his story of being born in 1864 in Monmouth, Oregon, and he recounted that the first wagon trains of the year 1843 were the most fortunate as the Indians left them alone, but not so in the subsequent years of 1844 and 1845 or even later on. He said on the 1843 trip, he said a cousin of his had died along the way and his Aunt Nancy was born, so there was no net loss of anyone on the trip, or at least in the ultimate numbers. But obviously we know as the Oregon Trail pioneers came down the Oregon Trail in the following years, there would be a lot more death and hardship. So he did tell stories of having no childhood really and working a grown man's job since the age of 8 when he had to bundle cedar shingles as fast as his dad and older brothers could make them and keep the cedar shavings raked up into piles to burn as darkness hit so they could continue to work into the night. And by the time they interviewed him, he was an old man, but he was a hard-working old man that was, at this point, a very skilled and knowledgeable miner. And he told a lot more stories about the olden days in Oregon, but those of you listening aren't interested in those stories or details. You want to know what he had to say about the Blue Bucket Mine, so we'll get into that now. So what he said about the Blue Bucket Mine is that the Blue Bucket Mine got its name from the blue buckets that were hanging at the back of the wagon. And these blue buckets they had like tar in them, stuff to basically grease the axles. So the bodies of the wagons and the buckets on these trips happened to be painted blue, and since he said the wagons had no hub nuts to hold a wheel in place on the axle, the wheels were held on the axle by what was called a linchpin, which was merely a pin or a bolt that slipped through a hole in the axle outside of the hub of the wheel. And between the hub and the pin, he said, was a washer which rubbed on the hub. And to prevent excess wear, it was necessary to constantly daub the axle at the point of friction. And they would daub it with tar, which the immigrants carried in the buckets that they hung on the hook at the rear of the wagon. And the tar buckets of this particular wagon train were also painted blue like the bodies of the wagon. So he said the wagon train made a dry camp, from what he had heard, where means there was no water in sight. And one night on the meadow in the valley between two ridges of hills was where they made camp for the night. So since they were in dry camp, they needed water for their horses or oxen or whatever, and the members of the wagon train set out on foot in each direction in an attempt to locate a small creek or a pond nearby. And each one of the people that went out to look for water carried one of the blue tar buckets. I'm assuming obviously these were water buckets that didn't have tar in them, but they were also painted blue. And it doesn't say how big they are. I mean, I don't know if they're 5-gallon buckets, if they're decent sized, or what the situation is, but assuming that they're probably halfway decent sized. So they go out in every direction with these buckets, he said, and this is from his account, from what he knows about from other pioneers' diaries or from other tales he's heard. So he said one of the members that evening came upon a wet, cozy spot where it appeared water was near the surface of the ground, but apparently it wasn't like a running stream. So this gentleman used the bucket like a spade, and he scooped the dirt down or dug down into the dirt or the sand or whatever, and he tried to scoop that away so he could get down to the water. And in the bucket with the wet dirt, he noticed it contained nuggets of gold. And that was how the Blue Bucket Mine was discovered, is what he said. And he said that, and he quoted, "I was privileged once to see a diary said to have been kept by a man whose name I believe was Warren. The man was a member of the Blue Bucket train. In the diary, he kept a day-by-day log of the train's progress. By a series of calculations based upon the mileages and directions given in the diary, I was able to reach a position which must have been in the vicinity of the fabulous mine. To further convince myself that I had actually found the mine's exact location in my search, one day I stumbled onto a weathered portion of a wagon box with unmistakable traces of blue paint still visible on its bleached boards. That wagon box was of the wagon train era, as evidenced by the foot of it that was built like a scow or a flatboat and was caulked with rags, fragments of which were still intact. Immigrant wagons were constructed in such a manner to permit them to ford streams handily without damaging their contents." And he said, "Well, there's my story of the Blue Bucket Mine. Many think the mine never existed. I think it did. However, I realize that my story would carry far more conviction if I were able to exhibit a few buckets of gold taken from it, regardless of the color of the buckets." So that was the account in 1938 that William or W.H. Hembree gave of his account of the Blue Bucket Mine. So with other accounts where people have tried to retrace an approximate route, I think a lot of people put the mine on a tributary of the John Day River, and it is said to be in, somewhere in or around the fossil beds. And there are two John Day fossil beds, an eastern unit and a western unit. It's said to be somewhere off of the eastern unit, which I think is tagged as the sheep unit. Anyhow, so most people believe that if this exists or existed, it is on a tributary in this area. Now, you also have to keep in mind that, waters shift and change and creeks change a lot, and this is before hardly anyone was in Oregon. There's a high possibility that there could have been a creek in an area that there isn't now, with lots of shifting waters and people capturing water on their properties and things like that. There could be a possibility that there's a gully or something somewhere that only gets some water in it when it rains, or that could be the case when they came through too. It sounds like that really could have been the case, because it wasn't running according to Mr. Hembree's account. He said it was just some wet soil or dirt where they dug down to water. The other accounts say it was a very small stream, and if it had been raining, maybe this wasn't a permanent stream. So hard to say, if it happens to still be out there, and if it's not a permanent stream, that could be a little more difficult to find. But it's possible that the Blue Bucket Mine is still out there somewhere off of the John Day River in kind of east central Oregon, and maybe it's out there for someone to find. If you like these kind of stories, definitely like and subscribe to my channel.